All right, friends, settle in, turn down the lights, and let the quiet of the room wrap around you. Tonight, we're journeying back into the shadows, back to the world of the medieval assassin. We've talked before about the cold, the lies, and the rusty daggers. We've peeled back the layers of Hollywood cool to reveal the grim, thankless reality of the job. But tonight, we go deeper. We're not just talking about the mission, we're talking about the spaces in between, the long, silent hours, the slow decay of the body, the relentless crumbling of the mind. We think of the assassin as a flash of steel in the dark, a moment of brutal, history-altering violence. But what if I told you that the deadliest enemy a medieval assassin ever faced wasn't a castle guard, or a paranoid baron, or even a treacherous client? What if I told you their greatest foe was silence, that it was filth, that it was their own fractured memory? So, get comfortable. Let the hum of the fan, or the whisper of the night, be your only companion, because we're about to explore why the moments before and after the kill were infinitely more terrifying than the act itself. This is the story of the rot that sets in when the adrenaline fades, and all you're left with is yourself, alone, in the dark. You think of yourself as an instrument of action, a whisper that becomes a blade, a shadow that solidifies into a final, fatal purpose. The stories, the songs, they all focus on that one explosive moment. The climb over the wall, the silent step in the chamber, the swift, clean strike. But that's a lie. That's maybe 1% of your life. The other 99%, it's waiting. You aren't the storm. You're the silence before the storm. And that silence is a vast, cold, empty ocean you have to cross alone. Your job, more than anything else, is to become a piece of the scenery, a forgotten crate in a warehouse, a bundle of rags in a forgotten alley, a patch of deeper shadow in the branches of an ancient oak overlooking the castle walls. And you wait. You wait for hours that feel like days, and days that feel like geological epochs. This isn't the tense, exciting waiting you see in movies, where the hero checks his watch and scans the horizon with narrowed eyes. This is a deep, soul-crushing, mind-numbing boredom so profound it becomes a physical weight. You sit in a hayloft for 3 days. The smell of dry grass and mouse droppings becomes the only air you breathe. You count the dust motes dancing in the single sliver of light that pierces the gloom. You learn the individual squeaks of the floorboards in the barn below. You learn the rhythm of the farmer's snores. You do this until you feel your own thoughts beginning to dissolve into the stale air. The physical strain is immense. You have to remain perfectly still for inhuman lengths of time. A cramp in your leg isn't an inconvenience. It's a potential disaster. A sneeze is a death sentence. An itch on your nose becomes a form of psychological torture. A tiny, insistent war being waged on your skin while you are sworn to absolute stillness. You eat, if you can call it that, the same piece of stale bread and dried meat for a week. Each bite, a silent, joyless chore. You ration water until your tongue feels thick and swollen in your dry mouth. But the physical discomfort is nothing compared to the mental assault. Your mind, your greatest weapon, starts to turn on you. The silence isn't empty. It's filled with whispers of doubt. Did they see you? Did that guard's patrol pattern just change? Was that the sound of a dog, or just the wind? Your senses, honed for sharpness, become your enemy. You start hearing footsteps in the rustle of leaves and seeing movement in the shifting of shadows. Paranoia begins to seep into the cracks of your boredom. a slow, cold poison. You aren't just waiting for a target, you are waiting for a pattern. You spend days, sometimes weeks, doing nothing but observing. You learn the castle's breath. You know which guard has a hacking cough, which servant girl sneaks out to meet a lover, at what time the cook throws out the kitchen scraps. You memorize the squeak of a specific gate, the number of steps in a patrol route, the exact moment when the torchlight from the western battlement is briefly blocked by a pillar. Your mind becomes a library of useless, vital information. This is your training montage. Not swinging a sword, but sitting in the cold, watching, and slowly going mad with the sheer, unrelenting monotony of it all. Imagine hiding in a sewer outflow pipe, the reek of human waste a constant companion, the cold water seeping into your boots. You're not thinking about honor or coin. You're thinking about the rat that just scurried over your foot. You're thinking about how you haven't stretched your legs in 12 hours. You're thinking that this is it. This is the glamorous life of a history changer, sitting in filth, praying that the man you're supposed to kill decides to take his evening stroll before you lose your mind or freeze to death. The action is a release, a mercy. It's the waiting, the endless, silent, boring waiting that truly breaks you. It hollows you out, leaving a shell of a person who is perfectly still, perfectly quiet, and screaming on the inside. But let's say the waiting is finally over. The pattern is learned, the moment has arrived, and you are ready to move. Your mind is sharp, focused by the sheer relief of having something, anything to do. Your body, however, has been fighting a different war all this time, a silent, losing battle against an enemy far more pervasive than any castle guard. The sleek, leather-clad assassin of fantasy is a pristine creature. You are not. You are a walking testament to the grime and decay of the medieval world, because you live in its forgotten corners. Your safe house isn't a cozy room at an inn. It's the space beneath a pigsty. It's a hollowed-out section of a garbage midden. It's a damp, unlit corner of a crypt where the air is thick with the sweet, cloying smell of old death. You are marinating in the world's waste, and it is claiming you piece by piece. Let's start with your skin. It is never clean. A constant layer of dirt, grime, and sweat is your second self. Rashes are a common companion. Angry red maps that chart the places where your wet clothes have rubbed your skin raw. Boils and sores fester in the dark, warm places of your body, a constant throbbing reminder of the bacteria you are swimming in. And a simple cut, a scrape from a loose brick or a splinter from a wooden beam, isn't an inconvenience. It's a potential death sentence. Without any means to clean it properly, you watch with a cold dread as the skin around it reddens, swells, and grows hot to the touch. You pray it doesn't turn into a raging infection that will leave you delirious with fever, an easy target for any passing watchman. Then there are your insides. The water you drink is scooped from stagnant barrels or scum-covered streams. It's teeming with things that want to make a home inside your guts. Dysentery is not a matter of if, but when. One day you're fine. The next your insides are in a constant churning rebellion, leaving you weak, dehydrated, and desperately trying to stifle the sounds of your own body's betrayal while hiding 10 feet from a guard post. The food, when you have it, is no better. Moldy bread, rancid meat, half-rotten fruit. You eat what you can find, and your stomach pays the price. You are perpetually malnourished, running on a fuel that is actively trying to poison you. You feel a constant, gnawing ache of hunger that is only briefly silenced by food that makes you sick. And you can never, ever escape the smell. It clings to you. The stench of stale sweat, of unwashed clothes, of the sewer you hid in yesterday, of the stable you're sleeping in tonight. It gets into your hair, your skin, your very pores. This isn't just unpleasant. It's a tactical liability. You are a whisper in the dark, a phantom. But phantoms don't smell like a latrine pit. Dogs can pick up your scent from 100 yards away. A guard with a keen nose might notice a foul odor on the wind, just as you're climbing a wall. You spend your life trying to become invisible, but your own body screams your presence to the world with every foul breath you take. Your lungs burn from the damp, cold air. A persistent cough becomes your shadow, a dry, racking thing you have to constantly suppress until your chest aches. You feel it building, a tickle in your throat, and you have to swallow it down, choke it back, because a single loud cough could unravel weeks of planning. In the winter, the cold sinks into your bones, a deep, persistent ache that never leaves. You get sick. Of course, fevers, chills, respiratory infections. But you can't rest. You can't have a bowl of hot soup and a warm bed. You have to endure it, shivering in the rain, your head pounding with fever, because the mission doesn't pause for your illness. There is no medieval sick leave. There is only survival or failure. Your medical plan is hope, and hope is a very poor physician. You look less like a deadly shadow and more like a plague victim on the run, a collection of aches, sores, and smells, held together only by sheer desperate will. This is the true physical cost of the job, not the glorious scars of battle, but the quiet, ignoble decay from the inside out. But even if your body somehow holds together, if you manage to avoid a fatal infection and endure the hunger and the cold, there's a far deeper rot setting in, a corrosion of the mind. The job doesn't end when you clean the blood off your blade and slip back into the night. It never ends. You carry it with you, a ghost that sits on your shoulder and whispers in your ear. Every kill leaves a scar, not on your skin, but on your soul. The first thing to go is sleep. Sleep stops being a refuge and becomes a battlefield. When you close your eyes, you don't find darkness, you find faces. The face of the guard you had to strangle, the surprise in his eyes turning to sheer animal terror. The face of the nobleman you stabbed in his bed, the gurgling sound he made as he drowned in his own blood. The faces, they don't go away. They are burned onto the inside of your eyelids. You jolt awake in a cold sweat, your heart hammering against your ribs, the phantom smell of blood in your nostrils. You start to fear sleep, to fight it, staying awake for days until exhaustion finally claims you, dragging you back down into the same gallery of horrors. Then the world outside of sleep becomes just as treacherous. Your senses, the tools of your trade, are now permanently wired for danger. You can't turn them off. Every snapped twig in the forest is an approaching soldier. Every unexpected knock on an inn door is the city watch coming for you. Every shadow in a crowded market holds a potential threat. This isn't professional caution. It's a deep, gnawing hypervigilance that eats away at your peace. You can never relax. To relax is to die. You sit in a tavern with your back to the wall, not out of cinematic coolness, but because you are genuinely terrified of what might be behind you. You watch everyone, the barmaid, the stable boy, the traveling merchant. Are they watching you? Do they know? This bleeds into a corrosive paranoia. Trust is a luxury you discarded long ago, and you can never get it back. You can't have friends. Friends ask questions. You can't have a lover. A lover might see the scars or wake up to your screaming nightmares. Every human connection is a liability, a potential weak point that can be exploited. You see plots in spilled ale and betrayals in a shared glance. The person who hired you is not your ally. They are the person most likely to kill you next to tie up loose ends. So you exist in a state of absolute isolation, a ghost walking among the living, unable to connect, unable to trust, forever on the outside, looking in. And what about the act itself? The violence. You become numb to it, which is its own kind of horror. You learn to silence the part of your brain that recoils from plunging a knife into another human being. You compartmentalize. You tell yourself it's a job, that they deserved it. But the wall you build to keep the horror out also keeps everything else out. Joy, love, pity, kindness. They become foreign concepts. You look at people and you don't see individuals. You see targets, obstacles, or irrelevant scenery. You've killed so many times that feeling anything at all feels like a risk. Your mind, once a honed blade, is now chipped and rusted from overuse. You have flashbacks in the middle of the day. A glint of light off a puddle might remind you of a dagger's edge. The smell of roasting meat might transport you back to a burning village. You are haunted, not by spirits, but by your own memory. You are a library of death, and every book is written in your own hand. People think the assassin's curse is a short life. No, the real curse is surviving long enough for your own mind to become a prison. A prison where the doors are locked, the guards are your own memories, and you are serving a life sentence. You fancy yourself a master of plans, a weaver of intricate webs. You imagine poring over crude maps by candlelight, your mind a razor-sharp instrument dissecting the fortress's defenses, identifying the single perfect weakness. You believe your success comes from superior intellect, from outthinking your opponent. Cute. The truth is, you're not a chess master. You're a blindfolded man walking through a minefield, and your only guide is a chorus of liars. The most dangerous weapon in your world isn't a crossbow or a vial of poison. It's information, and the information you get is almost always garbage. Think about who provides it. A disgruntled servant with a grudge? A stable boy you paid with 2 silver coins? A greasy little scribe who promises you the keys to the kingdom? These people aren't reliable sources. They're desperate, they're greedy, and most of them are terrified. They'll tell you what they think you want to hear, or what they think will get them the most coin with the least amount of risk. So you're told. The Baron makes his nightly rounds on the western wall at the 10th bell. You spend a week planning your entire operation around this single beautiful fact. You chart the moon's phases. You bribe the right people. You prepare your escape route. And on the night of the kill, you're perched on a rooftop, dagger ready, listening to the 10th bell echo across the silent city. And you wait, and you wait, and the Baron never comes. Why? Because the servant who told you that forgot to mention that the Baron only does his rounds when his gout isn't acting up. Or maybe the servant lied, took your coin, and immediately ran to the captain of the guard to report a suspicious man asking questions. Congratulations. Your perfect plan, built on a foundation of sand, has just collapsed, and the city watch is now sweeping the rooftops looking for you. This isn't a rare occurrence. It's the norm. You are operating on a diet of rumors, half-truths, and outright fabrications. The map you were given is 10 years old, and the secret passage it shows was bricked up last winter. The guard you bribed to leave a side gate unlocked got drunk and forgot, or worse, got scared and confessed everything. The poison you bought from the back alley alchemist wasn't a deadly neurotoxin. It was a mild laxative mixed with river mud. Now your target isn't dead. He's just angry and spending a lot of time in the privy with 2 extra bodyguards. And then there's the most insidious trap of all, the information provided by your own client. You assume they want the same thing you do, a successful kill, but sometimes the job isn't a job. It's a setup. You're told to assassinate a rival merchant in his study. You sneak in, ready for the kill, only to find the study empty except for 6 heavily armed men who have been waiting for you. Your client didn't want the merchant dead. He wanted you captured or killed, perhaps to send a message to someone else or to create a public incident he could exploit. You weren't the assassin. You were the pawn, the disposable piece in a much larger, more cynical game. You were a weapon being aimed back at yourself. You learn, through brutal trial and error, to trust nothing. You have to verify everything yourself. You spend agonizing weeks confirming a single detail, cross-referencing the whispers of one servant with the drunken boasts of a guard and the movements you observe with your own eyes. You become a master of piecing together fragments of unreliable data, looking for the one thread of truth in a tapestry of lies. Your real skill isn't in the kill. It's in sifting through the mountain of informational filth to find the one small hard nugget of fact you can build a plan on. But even then, you're always one lie away from disaster. One piece of bad information, one overlooked detail, and your elaborate scheme becomes a clumsy public execution, with you as the main attraction. You aren't a strategist, you're a gambler. And the house, stacked with liars and traitors, almost always wins. You survive not because your plans are brilliant, but because you are lucky enough to have based them on the one lie that happened, by sheer chance, to be true. You see the target, the corrupt bishop, the tyrannical lord. He is the reason you are here, the focal point of your entire miserable existence for the past month. Your mission is clean, surgical. One man, one death. You tell yourself this to make it palatable. You are a tool of justice, a shadowy scalpel, removing a cancer from the body politic, a noble lie for a dirty job. The problem is, the world is messy, cancer is never contained, and your scalpel is about to get very, very bloody. The truth is, there is no such thing as a clean kill. Between you and your target stands a small army of perfectly ordinary people just trying to get through their day. The sleepy guard at the gate who dreams of opening a bakery, the young maid scrubbing the floors who is saving her pennies to get married, the stable hand who knows every horse by name. They are not villains. They are not part of the tyranny. They are just in the way. And in your profession, anything in the way must be removed. So, you move through the castle, a ghost of purpose, but a guard rounds a corner unexpectedly. He doesn't draw his sword. He doesn't shout an alarm. He just looks at you, his eyes wide with confusion. "Who are you?" he asks, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. You have a split second to make a choice, and there is only one choice. You don't have time for a conversation. You can't knock him unconscious. He'll wake up and raise hell. So you close the distance, and the last thing that Baker-to-be ever sees is the flash of your blade. You didn't want to kill him. He was nobody, but now he's a bloody heap on the stone floor. A necessary casualty, a piece of collateral damage. You keep moving. You need to get to the Lord's chambers, but the corridor is being polished by a young servant girl. She has her back to you. You could wait, but waiting is a risk. Every second you linger increases your chances of being discovered, so you creep up behind her. What do? A garrote is silent. A quick, brutal snap of the neck. She will never get married. Her family will mourn a girl who simply vanished while cleaning a hallway. You tell yourself, It had to be done. You are a professional, but her face, which you never even saw, will join the chorus of ghosts that sing you to sleep at night. Your work is a ripple of death, spreading outwards from your target. To get to the one man who deserves to die, you might have to kill 5, 6, 10 people who did nothing wrong except be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You might have to set a fire as a diversion, fire that could trap innocent families in their beds. You might have to poison a wine cask, knowing that anyone who drinks from it, the Lord, his wife, his children, his guests, the servants who sneak a sip, will all die a writhing, agonizing death. This is the unspoken arithmetic of your profession. You are paid to kill one man, but the final invoice, written in blood, is always much, much higher, and you carry that debt. Each innocent life you take is another weight chained to your soul. At first, you might feel a pang of regret, a flicker of humanity, but you learn to crush it. You have to. Pity is a weakness you cannot afford. Hesitation is fatal. So you become a creature of cold, hard logic. That guard was an obstacle. That maid was a variable. That family was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the mission. But at what point does the cost outweigh the benefit? At what point do you, the righteous avenger, become a monster, far worse than the one you were sent to kill? You started this journey thinking you were different from the common murderer, the back alley thug. You had a purpose, a code, but standing over the body of a teenage stable boy whose only crime was hearing your footsteps, you realize the horrifying truth. There is no difference. You are a killer, and the distinction between target and collateral is a comforting fiction you tell yourself so you can live with the monster in the mirror. You are not a scalpel, you are a plague, and everyone you touch, innocent or guilty, is at risk of being consumed. Let's imagine the impossible. You failed. The blade slipped. The poison was detected. A dog barked at the worst possible moment. You were seen. Now the entire world, which was once a place to hide, has become a cage, and every person in it is a hunter. The romantic stories tell of the assassin's final stand, a blaze of glory against overwhelming odds, a heroic, defiant end. Nonsense. Your end will be anything but glorious. It will be a desperate, pathetic scramble into the darkness, and it will almost certainly end in shame, agony, and public humiliation. The moment you fail, you cease to be a phantom. You become a description, a man of medium height, wearing a dark cloak with a scar above his left eye. Suddenly, every city gate has men holding a crude sketch of your face. Every tavern buzzes with whispers of your description and the bounty on your head. The price isn't just gold, it's a royal pardon for some cutthroat who will gladly turn you in to save his own skin. The world shrinks with terrifying speed. The forests are no longer a sanctuary. They're filled with hunting parties. The cities are no longer a place to get lost in the crowd. Every face you see is a potential accuser. Your first instinct is to run. But where? You have no home, no allies. The client who hired you is now the person who wants you dead most of all. You are a loose end, a walking, talking witness to their conspiracy. They will put out a second contract, this time with your name on it, and the hunters will become the hunted. You are trapped between the vengeful forces of your former target and the cold, pragmatic betrayal of your former employer. So you hide. You crawl into the darkest, most foul places imaginable. You live in ditches and swamps, your wounds festering, your hunger a constant, gnawing beast. You are no longer a predator. You are prey. Every snapped twig, every hoot of an owl sends a jolt of pure terror through you. You are being hunted like an animal, and you know how it will end, because eventually you will make a mistake. Exhaustion will cloud your judgment. A villager will recognize you from a wanted poster. You'll be cornered in a barn, not by elite soldiers, but by angry farmers with pitchforks and torches. There will be no epic duel. They will beat you senseless, tie you up, and drag you back to the city like a prize pig. And that is when the true horror begins. Your death will not be quick. You will be tortured, not for information about who hired you. They already have their suspicions, and a confession from a traitorous assassin is easily fabricated. No, you will be tortured for spectacle, to make an example of you. You will be broken on the wheel, your limbs shattered one by one. You will be drawn and quartered, your insides pulled out while you are still breathing. Your head will be placed on a spike above the city gates, a rotting warning to any who would follow in your footsteps. Your final moments will not be filled with defiant thoughts or noble reflections. They will be a symphony of unimaginable pain and overwhelming regret. You will die alone, surrounded by a jeering crowd who sees you not as a person, but as a monster getting its just desserts. Your name, if you ever had a real one, will be forgotten. You will be remembered only as the traitor or the failed assassin. Your legacy will be a cautionary tale told to frighten children. This is the price of failure. Not a swift end in a glorious fight, but a slow, agonizing, public descent into nothingness. Your body dismantled for sport, your existence erased and replaced by a grotesque caricature of your own failure. Close your eyes. Picture a Viking. What do you see? A towering, bearded brute, his eyes wild with battle lust, a bearskin cloak thrown over his broad shoulders, a bloody axe in one hand, and on his head a helmet, a heavy iron helmet, adorned with two magnificent, curving horns, silhouetted against a stormy sky as he leaps from the prow of his longship onto a burning shore. It's a powerful image, iconic, unforgettable. It's also a complete and utter lie. That horned helmet, the single most enduring symbol of the Viking warrior, is a phantom, a piece of historical fiction so pervasive that it has completely eclipsed the truth. No Viking ever wore a horned helmet into battle, not one. Think about it for a moment. From a purely practical standpoint, imagine trying to fight in a chaotic shield wall, swinging an axe with two giant hooks sticking out of your head. You'd be a walking death trap for your own men. Your helmet would snag on shields, on rigging, on doorways, on your friend's beard. A well-aimed blow wouldn't even need to hit you. It could just catch a horn and wrench your neck with enough force to snap it. It's not just impractical, it's suicidally stupid. So, where did this myth come from? Not from the sagas, not from the archaeological record. We've unearthed countless Viking helmets. They were typically simple, functional bowls of iron or leather, sometimes with a nose guard, known as a spangen helm. They were designed for one thing: to stop a sword from splitting your skull open. No horns, no wings, no decorative nonsense. The myth of the horned helmet is a modern invention, a piece of 19th century romanticism that was likely born from the imagination of costume designers for Richard Wagner's epic opera cycle, Der Ring der Nibelungen. They wanted to create a visually striking, barbaric look for their Germanic heroes, and the horned helmet was born. It was pure theater, and it stuck. It was so powerful, so visually appealing, that it overwrote 1,000 years of actual history. This single, stubborn lie is the perfect gateway into the real world of the Vikings. Because just like we've been sold a fantasy about their headwear, we've been sold a fantasy about their entire existence. We see them as one-dimensional monsters, screaming berserkers whose only contribution to history was a trail of fire and blood. We've been taught to think of the Viking Age as a synonym for terror, a dark chapter of mindless destruction. But that's just the opera. It's the costume. The reality is infinitely more complex, more sophisticated, and far more fascinating. The horned helmet is a convenient lie because it allows us to keep the Vikings in a neat, simple box labeled barbarian. It saves us from the messy, complicated truth that the same people who raided monasteries were also cunning merchants, brilliant shipbuilders, pioneering explorers, and architects of a surprisingly complex legal and social system. So, let's do this. Let's take that horned helmet, that comfortable fiction, and set it aside. Let's look at the real faces, the real lives that it has hidden from us for so long. Because the moment you remove the horns, you stop seeing a monster. You start seeing a person, and that is where the real story begins. The story not just of the Viking warrior, but of the Viking world. A world built not just with axes, but with scales, plows, and laws. The word Viking itself has been hijacked. To us, it's a noun, a name for a people, but to them, it was a verb. Viking was a job description. It meant to go raiding, to go on an expedition. A man went a Viking. It was something you did, not something you were. And for the vast majority of Scandinavians during that age, it was a seasonal activity, a dangerous side hustle, not a full-time career. The rest of the year, that terrifying raider with the blood-soaked beard was a farmer. This is the first and most fundamental truth we have to grasp. The Viking world was overwhelmingly agrarian. Most Norsemen were not warriors dreaming of Valhalla. They were farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen, deeply tied to their land and their communities. Their lives were governed by the seasons, by the planting and the harvest. They lived in long houses, not as isolated families, but as extended households, with their kin, their servants, and their livestock all under one roof. They were worried about crop failures, about harsh winters, about their children surviving to adulthood. They were, in short, people. But they had a unique problem. The land they lived on, Scandinavia, was beautiful, but it was also harsh and unforgiving. Good, arable land was scarce. As the population grew, the pressure mounted. A younger son in a large family might have no land to inherit. He had a choice: stay and be a landless dependent, or find his fortune elsewhere. And this is where their single greatest innovation came into play: the longship. The Viking longship was not just a boat, it was a masterpiece of naval engineering, the key that unlocked the world. It was clinker built, with overlapping planks that made it strong yet flexible, able to bend with the waves rather than break against them. It had a shallow draft, meaning it could navigate not only the open ocean, but also shallow rivers, allowing them to strike deep inland where no one expected an attack. It was powered by both sail and oar, making it fast and maneuverable in any weather. This ship gave them an unprecedented mobility. It was their ticket out. It was their solution to the problem of scarcity. And so they went exploring. Some went to Viking. Yes, they used the element of surprise their ships gave them to raid the wealthy, poorly defended monasteries and coastal towns of Britain and Francia. It was brutal, opportunistic, and for some, incredibly profitable. It was a quick, violent injection of wealth into a resource-poor society. But to define their entire civilization by this one activity is like defining all of modern commerce by piracy. Many more went not as raiders, but as traders. They loaded their ships not with axes and shields, but with furs from the north, with walrus ivory, the white gold of the age, with amber from the Baltic, and with slaves captured in raids. They followed the rivers of Russia deep into the heart of the continent, establishing trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. They became known as the Rus, and their trading posts would eventually grow into the first Russian states. In Constantinople, they were so respected for their martial prowess that the Byzantine emperor recruited them as his personal bodyguard, the elite Varangian Guard. These Vikings weren't burning cities. They were navigating complex global trade networks, exchanging goods, cultures, and ideas. They were merchants with an axe at their belt, yes, but merchants nonetheless. And others still went simply as pioneers. They packed their families, their livestock, and their household goods into their incredible ships and set out across the violent North Atlantic in search of new land. They settled the Faroe Islands. They colonized Iceland, creating a new nation in a land of fire and ice. From Iceland, Eric the Red, exiled for manslaughter, led a fleet to an even more remote and icy shore he cannily named Greenland to attract settlers. And from Greenland, his son, Leif Erikson, sailed even further west, guided by sailors' rumors of a land sighted in the mist. Around the year 1000, 5 centuries before Columbus, Leif Erikson and his crew made landfall on the coast of North America, a place they called Finland. They were the first Europeans to set foot on the continent. They weren't there to raid, they were there to build, to settle, to start a new life on the edge of the known world. So yes, they were raiders. But they were so much more. They were farmers, struggling to survive in a harsh land. They were brilliant engineers who perfected the greatest ship of its age. They were cunning merchants who built a trade empire stretching from Canada to Baghdad. And they were arguably the most daring explorers in human history. To call them mere barbarians is not just an insult, it's a failure of imagination. It's choosing the cheap thrill of the opera over the profound, complex, and far more impressive reality. The image of the Viking as a lawless savage, a brute driven only by instinct and greed, is perhaps the most persistent myth of all. Even more so than the horned helmet, we imagine a world of chaos where the only law was the strength of your sword arm, a society where disputes were settled with an axe to the forehead. This vision of primal anarchy is simple, exciting, and completely wrong. The truth is, Norse society was not lawless. In fact, it was obsessively legalistic. The Vikings were governed by a complex and surprisingly sophisticated system of laws and social codes, and they placed a huge amount of importance on order, justice, and community consensus. The heart of the Viking legal and political world was an institution known as the Ing the Thing. The Thing was an assembly, a public gathering of the free men of a community or a region. It wasn't a parliament in the modern sense. It was part court, part legislature, and part community festival. These gatherings were held at regular intervals at a designated, often sacred, outdoor site. Here, in the open air, under the watch of their gods and their ancestors, they conducted the business of their society. At the Thing, new laws were made, and old ones recited. The laws were not written down, at least not in the early period. They were memorized and passed down orally by a law speaker, a respected figure elected for his wisdom and prodigious memory. His job was to recite a portion of the law code at each assembly, ensuring that the collective legal knowledge was never lost. This placed a huge emphasis on the spoken word, on honor, and on public memory. But the primary function of the thing was to resolve disputes. If a man felt he had been wronged, if his property was stolen, his relative was killed, or his honor was insulted, he didn't just grab his axe and seek mindless revenge. That would often lead to a destructive blood feud that could tear a community apart. The proper first step was to take the case to the thing. There, both the accuser and the accused would present their case before the assembled free men. They would call witnesses, present evidence, and swear sacred oaths on a holy ring to attest to the truth of their statements. The assembly would then act as a collective jury. After hearing the arguments, they would render a judgment. The punishments varied. For minor offenses, it might be a simple fine, a compensation paid to the injured party known as wergild or mangold. The amount was meticulously calculated based on the severity of the crime and the social standing of the victim. This system wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoration, about healing the rift in the social fabric. For more serious crimes, the punishment could be far more severe. A man found guilty of murder or treason could be declared an outlaw. This was a fate arguably worse than death. An outlaw was stripped of all his property and all his legal protections. He became a wolf in a sacred place, a man who could be killed on sight by anyone with no legal repercussions. He was cast out from the community of men, forced to live in the wilderness, hunted and alone. This fear of exile, of being cut off from the tribe, was a powerful deterrent. This system wasn't perfect, of course. It was heavily influenced by the power and reputation of the families involved. A powerful chieftain had a much better chance of winning his case than a poor farmer. And if one party refused to accept the judgment of the thing, the dispute could still escalate into violence. But the crucial point is that the system existed. It provided a framework for justice, a public forum for resolving conflict without resorting to immediate bloodshed. It shows a society that valued order, due process, and the rule of law. This legalistic mindset extended even to their raiding. The crews of longships often operated under a strict code of conduct known as a felic. Before setting out, the men would agree on the rules for the expedition, including how the loot would be divided. This wasn't a chaotic free-for-all. It was a business venture with agreed-upon terms. The legendary Jomsvikings, a semi-mythical order of Viking mercenaries, were said to have an incredibly strict code that governed every aspect of their lives, from who could join to how they must behave in battle. While likely exaggerated, these stories reflect the Norse ideal of a warrior community bound by laws and oaths. The Vikings didn't fear law, they revered it. It was the invisible structure that held their volatile world together, the force that turned a collection of fierce individuals into a functioning and formidable society. We picture them living in squalor, filthy, lice-infested brutes, their hair and beards matted with the grime of battle and the grease of a half-cooked feast. We imagine them reeking of stale sweat and unwashed bodies, their long houses filled with mud, bones, and the stench of human waste. It's a convenient image, one that fits neatly into our prefabricated box labeled barbarian. It allows us to feel a comfortable sense of superiority, to look back and thank our lucky stars for soap and sanitation. But what if the archaeological record tells a completely different story? What if the evidence we dig from the earth paints a picture not of filth, but of a people who were, by the standards of their time, surprisingly vain and obsessed with personal hygiene? Let's dig into a Viking grave, or settlement mound. What do we find? Alongside the swords, axes, and shields, combs, so many combs, exquisitely carved combs made from bone, antler, or ivory. We find tweezers, often worn on a string around the neck. We find ear spoons, small, delicate instruments for cleaning wax from the ears. These aren't the tools of a people who have given up on cleanliness. These are the personal grooming kits of a society that cared deeply about its appearance. The sagas, our best literary window into their world, are filled with references to hair washing, bathing, and the importance of being well groomed. Important chieftains are often described by their well-kept hair or magnificent beards. A clean, combed appearance was a sign of status and self-respect. The famous Arab diplomat, Ibn Fadlan, who encountered a group of Rus Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century, was famously disgusted by their morning ritual. He described them sharing a single bowl of water to wash their faces and clear their throats, a practice he found utterly revolting. But his disgust obscures a key detail: they were washing every single morning. Compare that to the bathing habits of many other European societies at the time, where a full bath might be a once-a-year event. The Vikings, in fact, were known for their love of bathing. The Old Norse word for Saturday, lagerdagur, literally means washing day or bath day. They had a weekly ritual dedicated to getting clean. They enjoyed saunas, steaming themselves before plunging into a cold river or a snowbank, a practice that is still a cornerstone of Scandinavian culture today. In England, where they settled and were often viewed with a mixture of fear and suspicion, the Vikings developed a reputation for being almost too clean. The 13th century English chronicler John of Wallingford complained that the Danish men were so popular with English women because they combed their hair daily, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes frequently. He grumbled that these cleanly habits allowed them to seduce the wives of the nobility and even the daughters of thanes. They weren't just conquering the land, they were winning over the local women with their superior hygiene. Their homes, the longhouses, while certainly smoky and crowded, were not the pigsties of our imagination. They were well-organized, domestic spaces. Archaeological evidence shows distinct areas for cooking, for sleeping on raised wooden platforms, and for craftwork. They had drainage ditches dug around the houses to keep the interior dry, and while they did live in close quarters with their animals in the winter, a common practice across Europe to conserve heat, they were not living in a chaotic mess. It was a functioning, organized household. This focus on order and appearance extended to their clothing. They loved bright colors, dyes made from plants, like woad for blue and madder for red, were common. They wore tailored clothes, not just shapeless animal skins. Viking women, in particular, were known for their intricate jewelry, beautiful oval brooches that held up the straps of their dresses, strings of glass beads from distant lands, and delicate silver pendants. This wasn't just decoration. It was a display of wealth, status, and connection to a wider world. It was a statement that we are not just raiders from a frozen wasteland. We are people of substance, people of style. So why does the myth of the filthy Viking persist? Because it's easy. It fits the narrative. It's simpler to imagine a savage covered in mud than it is to picture a warrior who stops to comb his beard and pick his ears before going into battle. The truth is, their world was a tough, often brutal place, but they did not surrender to the grime. They fought against it. They found dignity and identity in order, in cleanliness, in the careful presentation of themselves to the world. They understood that you could be a fierce warrior and still want to look good. The real Viking wasn't just a threat to your life. He might also steal your girlfriend because he smelled better and had a nicer comb. He bursts into the story like a force of nature, the berserker. The name itself sends a shiver down the spine, bare-chested or clad only in the skin of a wolf or a bear. He enters the battlefield not as a soldier, but as a living incarnation of madness. He howls. He foams at the mouth. He bites the rim of his own shield in a fit of uncontrollable rage. He is immune to pain, insensible to fear, possessed by a primal fury that gives him the strength of 10 men. He is the Viking superweapon, a terrifying, unstoppable juggernaut of pure destruction. This is the legend of the berserker, and it is one of the most potent and terrifying images from the Viking Age. But what was it? Was it a real phenomenon? And if so, what on earth was happening to these men? Was it divine possession, a secret drug, a psychological condition, or something else entirely? The sagas are our primary source, and they are filled with tales of these fearsome warriors. They often describe the berserker gang, the berserker's rage, as a kind of trance or fit. It would begin with shivering and chattering teeth, his face swelling and changing color. Then the rage would descend, a state of complete mindless fury. In this state, he would attack anything in his path, friend and foe alike, until the fit passed. Afterwards, he would be left utterly drained and weak, as helpless as a child. The Old Norse term berserker is thought to mean either bear shirt, referring to the skins they wore, or bear shirt, meaning they fought without armor. But either way, it describes a warrior who has cast aside normal human limits and embraced a state of animalistic frenzy. So what was the cause? One of the most popular theories is drugs, specifically the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms, such as Amanita muscaria, the iconic red and white toadstool. This mushroom is known to cause delirium, agitation, distorted perception, and feats of unusual strength, followed by a period of deep stupor, a pattern that seems to fit the descriptions of the berserker gang remarkably well. The idea is that a select group of warriors would ingest these mushrooms before a battle to induce their terrifying rage. Another theory points not to a drug, but to a self-induced psychological state. It could have been a form of battle hypnosis or ritualistic trance. Through a combination of war chants, rhythmic breathing, and intense focus, a warrior might be able to work himself into a dissociative state, shutting down the parts of his brain responsible for fear and self-preservation. It would be a kind of weaponized hysteria, a deliberate surrender to the most primal parts of the psyche. This fits with the idea of berserkers as members of a warrior cult, perhaps dedicated to the god Odin, who was himself a master of ecstatic, trance-like states. But there's a more mundane, and perhaps more chilling, possibility. What if it was all a performance? What if the berserker was not a man possessed, but a master of psychological warfare? Imagine you are an Anglo-Saxon peasant, conscripted to defend your village. You're standing in a shield wall, terrified, your hands slick with sweat on your spear shaft, and across the field, a handful of enemy warriors start to howl like wolves. They bite their shields, they throw off their armor, and they charge your lines with no regard for their own lives. You wouldn't see a tactic. You would see a monster. You would see something unnatural, something unkillable. The sheer terror, inspired by such a display, might be enough to break your shield wall before the first blow even landed. In this view, the berserker wasn't a secret weapon. He was a terror tactic, a calculated display of madness designed to shatter enemy morale. It's likely that the truth is a combination of all these things. There may have been warrior cults that used mushrooms or other substances. There may have been individuals who were able to induce a trance-like state through ritual, and there were almost certainly warriors who simply acted the part, knowing the devastating psychological impact it would have. Over time, these different realities would have blended together in the stories, creating the legend of the unstoppable, supernatural warrior we know today. But the sagas also tell another side of the story. In peacetime, berserkers were not heroes. They were feared and reviled. They were seen as dangerous liabilities, bullies who couldn't control their violent tempers. Later Christian law codes in Iceland and Norway specifically outlawed berserkers, making the act of going berserk a crime punishable by exile. The very thing that made them so valuable in war made them intolerable in peace. They were a weapon that was too dangerous to keep around the house. The legend of the berserker is a window into the Viking understanding of rage itself, a powerful, sometimes useful force, but ultimately a destructive and inhuman one. It was a fire that could win a battle, but it was also a fire that could burn your own house down. They came in a blaze of fire and fury, and for 3 centuries, they were the terror of the known world. And then, as quickly as they appeared, they vanished. The raids stopped. The longships were beached. The Viking Age came to an end. It's easy to think of them as a historical dead end, a violent flash in the pan that left little behind but ruined monasteries and a legacy of fear. But that's the final and greatest myth of all. The Vikings didn't just vanish, they assimilated, they settled, they evolved, and in doing so, they didn't just disappear from history. They became a fundamental part of the DNA of the modern world. Their legacy is not written in fire. It's written in our language, our laws, our maps, and our genes. Look at the map of Britain. It is littered with Viking footprints. Hundreds of towns and villages still bear the names their Norse settlers gave them. Any place, name ending in by, like Grimsby or Derby, comes from the Old Norse word for farm or village. An ending of Thorpe meant new settlement. An ending of Thort meant a clearing in the forest. These aren't just quaint names. They are a map of a massive Scandinavian colonization, a permanent demographic shift that reshaped the landscape of northern and eastern England, an area that became known as the Danelaw. Listen to the English language you are hearing right now. It is saturated with Old Norse. When you get a gift, feel sick, or look at your own skin, you are using Viking words. Common, everyday words like sky, leg, window, husband, knife, angry, ugly, weak, wrong, they, them, and their are all direct imports from the language of the settlers. They didn't just add a few loan words. They fundamentally altered the grammar and syntax of Old English, simplifying it and giving it much of the structure it has today. The Vikings are not a foreign influence on English. They are woven into its very fabric. You cannot speak a single sentence in modern English without waking the ghosts of the Norsemen. Their impact on political structures was just as profound. In Normandy, France, a region named for the Northmen who settled there, the Viking leader Rollo and his descendants adopted French language and customs, but they kept their Norse spirit of organization and military prowess. A century and a half later, his direct descendant, William the Conqueror, would lead the Norman conquest of England in 1066, a pivotal event that forever changed the course of English, and by extension, world history. The English monarchy, to this day, traces its lineage back to these French-speaking Vikings. In the East, the Rus Vikings, who established the trade routes to Constantinople, laid the foundations for the first Russian state, the Kievan Rus. Their name, Rus, became the name of the country itself, Russia, and their legacy isn't just political or linguistic, it's in our blood. Genetic studies have shown a significant and lasting Scandinavian contribution to the gene pool of the British Isles, particularly in Scotland, Ireland, and the north of England. They didn't just raid and leave. They stayed. They farmed. They married. They had children. They became part of the landscape and the people. The Viking Age ended not because they were defeated, but because they succeeded too well. They succeeded in finding new lands, building new kingdoms, and integrating themselves into the fabric of European society. The reason the raids stopped is that the old pressures of land scarcity and population growth had been solved. The younger sons no longer had to go a Viking to find their fortune. They could find it in Normandy, in England, in Iceland, or along the rivers of Russia. They stopped being outsiders and became insiders. They converted to Christianity, adopted new customs, and slowly but surely, their distinct identity merged with the cultures they had once terrorized and then revitalized. So, the next time you see that horned helmet, remember the truth it hides. The Vikings were not a dead end. They were a catalyst, a violent, disruptive, but ultimately creative force that reshaped the world. They were the last of the great barbarian migrations that forged the nations of Europe. Their longships may be gone, but the wake they left behind continues to ripple through our world, in the words we speak, the places we live, and the stories we tell. They didn't just burn down the old world, they helped build the new one. Step into the medieval world, and the first thing that hits you is the sheer fragility of life. It was a world of sharp edges and festering wounds, of sudden fevers and lingering plagues. Death was not a distant concept. It was a constant, intimate companion, lurking in a rusty nail, a sip of bad water, a winter cough, and standing between you and that ever-present darkness was a figure we now view with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination, the medieval physician. Our modern minds conjure an immediate image, a figure cloaked in black, his face hidden behind a grotesque, beaked mask stuffed with sweet-smelling herbs. We see a quack, a charlatan, a man armed with leeches, saws, and a profound ignorance of the human body. We picture him muttering incantations, consulting astrological charts, and prescribing remedies that were more likely to kill than to cure. He is the symbol of a dark age, a man who fought disease with superstition, a butcher posing as a healer. This image, like the Vikings' horned helmet, is a caricature. It's a comfortable story we tell ourselves to highlight our own enlightened scientific age. We draw a straight line from their barbaric practices to our sterile operating theaters and life-saving antibiotics, and we pat ourselves on the back for how far we've come. But what if that line isn't so straight? What if the medieval physician wasn't just a fumbling quack? What if within the severe limitations of his world, he was a scholar, an observer, a pioneer engaged in a desperate, rational struggle against an invisible enemy he could not comprehend? The men who practiced medicine in the Middle Ages weren't village idiots. The best of them were university-educated intellectuals. They studied at the great new universities of Bologna, Padua, Paris, and Oxford. They read the works of the ancient masters, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, and Galen, the Roman physician, whose theories would dominate Western medicine for over 1,500 years. They were fluent in Latin, the international language of scholarship. They engaged in rigorous debate, wrote learned treatises, and saw themselves as part of a continuous ancient tradition of healing. Their world was not our world. They had no concept of germs, no understanding of cellular biology, no knowledge of DNA. Their entire intellectual framework was built on a different foundation. But to dismiss them as fools is to commit the ultimate historical sin, judging the past by the standards of the present. They were not ignorant. They were working with a different set of maps. So let's do what we do best. Let's set aside the caricature of the plague doctor. Let's wipe the smug smile of modern superiority from our faces. Let's step into their world, not to mock their failures, but to understand their logic. Let's look at the medieval doctor, not as a villain or a fool, but as a detective, working with a handful of cryptic clues, trying to solve the profound and terrifying mystery of human suffering, armed with nothing but ancient books, keen observation, and the flickering candle of human reason against an overwhelming darkness. It is the single most ridiculed practice in the history of medicine. Bloodletting. The very word conjures images of barbers with bloody razors, of patients being bled into bowls until they fainted, a universal panacea applied with reckless abandon for everything from a common cold to a case of lovesickness. To us, it seems like sheer, unadulterated madness, draining the very life force from a person who is already sick. It's the medical equivalent of trying to put out a fire with gasoline. And yet, for nearly 2,000 years, from the time of the ancient Greeks until the late 19th century, bloodletting was not a fringe practice. It was the absolute cornerstone of mainstream orthodox medicine. It was practiced by the most learned and respected physicians on the planet. Popes were bled. Kings were bled. Scholars were bled. So the question we have to ask is not, how could they be so stupid? The question is, what was their logic? Because they had one. It was a complex, internally consistent, and deeply rational system. The fact that it was completely, utterly wrong doesn't make it any less logical. The entire system was built on the theory of the four humors, first codified by Hippocrates and later expanded by Galen. This theory held that the human body was composed of four fundamental fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with an element: air, water, fire, earth, a season: spring, winter, summer, autumn, and a set of qualities: hot and moist, cold and moist, hot and dry, cold and dry. A healthy person was someone in whom these four humors were in perfect balance. Sickness, therefore, was not caused by an external invader, like a germ. Sickness was an internal imbalance, a dyscrasia. One of the humors was either deficient or, more commonly, in excess. From this core premise, everything else flowed with a beautiful, if flawed, logic. What was the physician's job? To restore balance. If a patient presented with a fever, a flushed face, and a racing pulse, the diagnosis was clear. These were signs of heat and moisture. The patient had an excess of blood, the hot and moist humor. The treatment, therefore, was obvious and direct. Remove the excess blood. Bloodletting was not a random act of violence. It was a targeted therapeutic intervention designed to bring the body's internal ecosystem back to a state of equilibrium. There were two main methods. Venesection, the most common form, involved cutting into a vein, usually in the arm, and draining a specific amount of blood into a bowl. The amount was not random. Physicians had complex charts that dictated how much blood to remove based on the patient's age, constitution, the season, and the specific illness. The second method was leeching, using medicinal leeches to draw blood from more localized areas. This was considered a gentler, more precise method for treating things like headaches or inflammation. This humoral theory explained everything. It was a grand, unified theory of medicine. A person who was lethargic, and pale had an excess of phlegm, cold and moist. A person who was irritable and aggressive had an excess of yellow bile, hot and dry. A person suffering from depression was afflicted by an excess of black bile, cold and dry, the source of melancholy. Every symptom could be mapped onto the grid of the four humors, and every treatment, from bloodletting and purging to changes in diet and environment, was designed to counteract the imbalance. We mock it now because we know it's wrong. We know that bleeding a patient suffering from an infection was likely draining their immune system and hastening their death. We know that George Washington was likely bled to death by his physicians as they tried to treat his throat infection. But we have the benefit of microscopes and 200 years of germ theory. They did not. Imagine their perspective. Sometimes it even seemed to work. A patient with high blood pressure, a concept they didn't have, might feel a temporary sense of relief after being bled. The placebo effect, the powerful belief that a treatment is working, would have been immense. In a world with no effective medicines for most ailments, the dramatic, tangible act of bloodletting was a powerful piece of medical theater. It showed that something was being done. To dismiss this entire intellectual edifice as stupidity is to miss the point. This was their science. It was a system built on observation of symptoms, hypothesis, humoral imbalance, and intervention, bleeding. It was an attempt to impose a rational, ordered system onto the terrifying chaos of disease. It was a noble failure, a magnificent wrong turn, but it was not madness. It was the most advanced medical logic they had, and they clung to it for centuries, not because they were fools, but because it was the only coherent explanation of their world they had ever known. The scene is almost impossible for a modern mind to comprehend. You are lying on a wooden table in a room lit by flickering torches. There is no anesthetic. There is no sterile field. The man standing over you is not wearing a surgical mask or latex gloves. He is a barber surgeon, his leather apron stained with the blood of the man who came before you. He holds up a saw. Your leg has been crushed by a fallen cart, and the flesh has turned black with gangrene. The only way to save your life is to remove the limb. You are given a leather strap to bite down on, and a generous swig of wine or brandy, a pathetic defense against the tidal wave of agony that is about to hit you. Two strong assistants hold you down, and then the cutting begins. This was the world of medieval surgery. It was not a world for the faint of heart. It was a realm of brutal necessity, of incredible courage on the part of both the patient and the practitioner, and of astonishing, almost unbelievable technical skill. We tend to lump all medieval medicine together, but there was a crucial distinction between the university-trained physician and the hands-on surgeon. The physician was a man of theory, of books and diagnosis. He rarely got his hands dirty. The surgeon was a craftsman, a man of the blade. He was the one who dealt with the physical realities of the body, setting bones, stitching wounds, and when all else failed, cutting. Surgery was not a respected profession in the early Middle Ages. It was considered a manual trade, often performed by barbers who had the sharp tools and steady hands for the job. But as the centuries wore on, and especially in the crucible of the Crusades, where battlefield injuries were common, surgery began to evolve into a more specialized and respected field. Great surgical pioneers, like Guy de Chauliac and Henri de Mondeville, wrote extensive textbooks filled with detailed anatomical drawings and step-by-step instructions for complex procedures. And the procedures they performed were breathtaking in their audacity. Amputation was, of course, a grim staple. The key was speed. A skilled surgeon could sever a limb in a matter of minutes, sometimes in less than one. The faster the operation, the less time for the patient to die of shock and blood loss. After the cut, the surgeon would cauterize the stump with a red-hot iron, searing the blood vessels shut in a cloud of smoke and the horrifying smell of burning flesh. It was butchery, yes, but it was life-saving butchery. But they did much more than amputate. They performed cataract surgery, using a fine needle to couch the lens of the eye, pushing the clouded lens out of the way to restore a degree of sight. They treated bladder stones, a common and agonizing ailment, with a terrifying procedure called a lithotomy, cutting into the perineum to extract the stone by hand. They set complex fractures, using intricate systems of pulleys and weights for traction. And then there was trepanation, the act of drilling a hole in the human skull. This is an ancient procedure, practiced for thousands of years, and it continued into the medieval period. It was most commonly used to treat skull fractures, relieving pressure on the brain from swelling or bleeding. The surgeon would use a tool called a trephine, a kind of hand-cranked drill, to carefully bore through the bone, stopping just short of the delicate membrane covering the brain. The survival rate for this procedure, astonishingly, was relatively high. Skulls have been found with clear evidence of healing around the trepanned hole, meaning the patient lived, sometimes for many years, after having their head drilled open. Of course, the two great enemies of the medieval surgeon were ever present: pain and infection. They had no true anesthetics. They relied on alcohol, on opium-soaked sponges, which were moderately effective but dangerously unpredictable, and on sheer speed. The patient's ability to endure unimaginable pain was a prerequisite for survival. Infection was an even greater foe. The concept of germs was centuries away, while some surgeons, like Theodoric Borgononi, intuitively argued for a cleaner approach to wound care, advocating washing wounds with wine and using clean bandages. They were in the minority. Most surgeons operated under the theory of laudable pus. They believed that the formation of thick yellow pus in a wound was a good sign, a natural part of the healing process. We now know this is the sign of a raging staph infection. Consequently, post-operative infection was rampant and likely killed more patients than the surgery itself. And yet, despite the pain, despite the filth, despite the ever-present threat of a fatal infection, they kept working, they kept cutting, they kept innovating. They were walking a tightrope without a net, driven by a desperate need to intervene in the face of suffering. The medieval surgeon was not a thoughtless butcher. He was a pragmatist in a brutal world. He was a craftsman who, with nothing but a sharp blade, a steady hand, and an iron will, stood on the front lines of the war against death, fighting to pull his patients back from the brink, one terrifying, agonizing, and courageous cut at a time. While the surgeon's saw and the physician's lancet dominate our grim imagination of medieval medicine, another, quieter form of healing was taking place. It wasn't happening in the gore-spattered theaters of the barber surgeons or the austere halls of the universities. It was happening in the tranquil, walled gardens of monasteries, tended by the careful hands of monks and nuns. Here, far from the dramatic interventions of the blade and the bleed, a different kind of medicine flourished, a deep, ancient, and profoundly practical knowledge of the healing power of plants. This was the world of herbalism, the green heart of medieval healthcare. It was the medicine of the people, the first and often only line of defense against the countless ailments of daily life. And for centuries, the scriptoria and gardens of the monasteries were the great libraries and laboratories of this botanical wisdom. We think of monasteries as places of prayer and contemplation, isolated from the world. But in many ways, they were the Silicon Valleys of their time, centers of knowledge, technology, and preservation. While the world outside was often consumed by war and instability, the monks were engaged in the slow, patient work of copying. They copied the Bible, yes, but they also copied the great scientific and medical texts of the ancient world. The works of Dioscorides, the Greek physician whose encyclopedic De Materia Medica cataloged hundreds of medicinal plants, survived the so-called Dark Ages precisely because monks in places like Monte Cassino in Italy, in St. Gall in Switzerland, painstakingly reproduced them, page by page. But they weren't just passive librarians, they were active practitioners and experimenters. Almost every monastery had an infirmary to care for its own sick brothers, and a hospital to serve the local community. And attached to that infirmary was a physic garden, a meticulously organized botanical collection, where they cultivated the herbs they needed for their remedies. These were not just random patches of weeds. They were living pharmacies, laid out in neat beds, each plant with a specific purpose. Walk through one of these gardens in your mind. You would find sage, prized for its use in treating coughs and cleaning teeth. You would find rosemary, used as a preservative and believed to strengthen the memory. There would be fever, whose name speaks for itself, used to treat fevers and headaches. You'd see comfrey, known as knitbone, its roots and leaves mashed into a poultice to help heal broken bones and sprains. There would be valerian, the medieval Valium, its pungent root used to calm the nerves and promote sleep. There would be foxglove, a beautiful but deadly plant from which we now derive the heart medication deadliest. They didn't know the biochemical mechanism, but they knew, through centuries of trial and error, that a carefully prepared dose could help with dropsy, the swelling caused by congestive heart failure. The monks prepared these herbs in a variety of ways. They would be dried and stored for the winter. They would be boiled into infusions and teas. They would be steeped in wine to create medicinal tinctures. They would be ground into powders or mixed with fats like lard or beeswax to create salves and ointments for skin conditions and wounds. One of the most famous medieval remedies was a wound cleaning solution from a 10th century Anglo-Saxon text known as Bald's Leech Book. It called for garlic and another onion-like plant to be crushed and brewed in wine, then left to sit in a brass vessel for 9 days. In 2015, modern scientists at the University of Nottingham recreated this 1,000-year-old recipe. They found that it was astonishingly effective at killing methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, one of the most dangerous modern superbugs. The monks, without any knowledge of bacteria, had stumbled upon a powerful antibiotic combination. This knowledge was not magic. It was empirical science, learned the hard way. For every effective remedy, there were surely dozens that were useless or even harmful. But over generations, a vast body of practical knowledge was accumulated, a folk wisdom that was tested, refined, and passed down. The monastery was the crucible where this folk knowledge met the scholarly tradition of the ancient texts. It was a place where the humble wisdom of the garden was elevated by the intellectual rigor of the scriptorium. This green medicine was, for most people, the only medicine. A university-trained physician was incredibly expensive, a luxury reserved for the wealthy elite. The local surgeon could set a bone, but for the fevers, the aches, the infections, and the anxieties of everyday life, you went to the monastery. You went to the local wise woman, whose knowledge of herbs was passed down through her family. This was the healthcare system of the medieval world, a quiet, resilient network of healers, armed with the green bounty of the earth. It was a medicine that was gentle, accessible, and as modern science is beginning to rediscover, often surprisingly effective. Imagine a city under siege, not by an army with catapults and battering rams, but by an invisible, indiscriminate enemy, a foe that slips through locked gates, ignores social status, and kills with terrifying speed. It arrives without warning, a whisper of a rumor that becomes a tide of death. This was the reality of the Black Death, the great pestilence that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, wiping out an estimated third to a half of the entire population. In the face of such an incomprehensible catastrophe, the medical systems of the day, the humoral theory, the herbal remedies, were utterly powerless. The physicians were baffled. The prayers of the priests went unanswered. The social order crumbled. It was an apocalyptic moment, a trauma so profound that it would reshape the course of Western civilization. And yet, out of this maelstrom of fear and death, a revolutionary new idea was born. An idea so simple and so powerful that we still use it today as our primary weapon against pandemics. It was the concept of quarantine. The word itself, quarantine, comes from the Italian quarante giorni, meaning 40 days, and it was in the bustling, plague-ravaged port cities of the Venetian Republic that this idea was first put into practice. The city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, a key trading hub on the Adriatic coast, was one of the first to act. In 1377, its city council issued a decree that would change the world. They declared that any ship arriving from a plague-infested area would not be allowed to enter the city. Instead, the ship, its crew, and its cargo had to anchor at a nearby island and wait for a period of 30 days, Trentine, before they could disembark. This was a radical act. It was the first time a government had ever tried to systematically impose a period of isolation on travelers to prevent the spread of disease. It wasn't based on a sophisticated understanding of germ theory. They still believed the plague was spread by miasma, or bad air. But it was based on a crucial empirical observation. The disease had a latency period. People who seemed healthy could still carry the sickness. The only way to be sure was to wait. The idea spread like wildfire through the Italian city-states. Venice, the maritime superpower, quickly adopted and refined the system. They extended the isolation period to 40 days, perhaps for symbolic religious reasons. The 40 days of Lent, the 40 days of the flood. They established the world's first dedicated quarantine station, or lazaretto, on an island in the Venetian lagoon in 1423. Here, sailors and merchants would live out their 40 days in designated housing, under the watch of armed guards. Their cargo, especially textiles, would be aired out and fumigated, in the belief that this would cleanse it of the poisonous miasma. Think about the sheer administrative and logistical challenge of this. It required a powerful, centralized state to enforce it. It required a bureaucracy to keep records, a police force to prevent breaches, and a system to provide food and water to the thousands of people held in isolation. It was an unprecedented expansion of state power over the movement and health of individuals, and it was deeply unpopular. Merchants chafed at the costly delays. Sailors despaired at being confined to a desolate island after a long voyage. But it worked. The cities that rigorously enforced quarantine measures, like Venice and Milan, tended to fare better in subsequent outbreaks than those that did not. This was not medicine in the traditional sense. It was public health. It was a shift in thinking from treating the individual sick patient to protecting the entire community. It was a tacit admission that the old medical theories were failing. While the physicians were busy bleeding patients and prescribing useless potions, the city magistrates and health officials were taking practical preventative action on a massive scale. They were fighting the plague, not with prayers or potions, but with regulations, guard posts, and the cold, hard logic of isolation. This was a profound intellectual leap. It was the birth of epidemiology, the study of how disease spreads and how it can be controlled. It was a lesson learned in the crucible of the worst pandemic in human history. They didn't know why it worked. They didn't know about Yersinia pestis or the fleas that carried it, but they knew that it worked. They had found a weapon, a brutal, costly, and socially disruptive weapon, but a weapon nonetheless. The next time you see a sign at an airport for quarantine, the next time you hear a public health official talk about isolation protocols, remember where that idea came from. It came from the terror of the Black Death, from the desperate pragmatism of medieval city officials who, faced with the end of their world, invented the future of public health. You are sick. A fever rages through your body, leaving you weak and shivering. A deep, hacking cough racks your chest. The physician has come and gone. He has bled you, diagnosed an imbalance of phlegm, and prescribed a diet of warm, moist foods. The herbalist has given you a bitter tea of sage and hyssop. You have taken the remedies. You have followed the advice, and still, you are sick. You are frightened. You feel your life slipping away. What do you do? Where do you turn when the limits of earthly medicine have been reached? You turn to God. In the medieval world, medicine and faith were not separate domains. They were inextricably intertwined. The body and the soul were two sides of the same coin, and an illness in one was often seen as a symptom of a sickness in the other. Disease was not just a biological malfunction. It was a spiritual event. It could be a test from God, a punishment for sin, or a demonic assault on a vulnerable soul. Therefore, the ultimate act of healing was not just to rebalance the humors, but to restore the patient's relationship with the divine. The first and most powerful form of this spiritual medicine was prayer. The patient would pray. Their family would pray. The entire village might gather in the local church to pray for their recovery. The priest was as important a figure in the healing process as the physician. He would hear the sick person's confession, absolving them of their sins and preparing their soul for whatever might come. He would anoint them with holy oil, a sacrament known as extreme unction or the last rites. While this was officially for the health of the soul, it was widely believed to have a powerful effect on the health of the body as well. But the medieval world had a much more direct and tangible way of seeking divine intervention. The cult of the saints. Saints were holy men and women who after death were believed to reside in heaven as direct intercessors with God. They were the spiritual superheroes of the age, each with their own specialty. If you had a toothache, you prayed to Saint Apollonia, who had her teeth shattered during her martyrdom. If you had an eye affliction, you prayed to Saint Lucy. For ailments of the throat, Saint Blaise was your man. And for the most dreaded disease of all, the plague, you turned to Saint Sebastian, the Roman soldier martyred with arrows, or Saint Roche, who had survived the pestilence himself. Seeking a saint's help was an active process. You didn't just pray at home. You went on a pilgrimage. You would journey, sometimes for hundreds of miles, to a shrine that housed the relics of the saint, a piece of their bone, a lock of their hair, a fragment of their clothing. These relics were believed to be conduits of immense divine power. At the shrine you would pray, leave an offering, and perhaps touch or kiss the reliquary. You might leave behind a small wax model of the afflicted body part, a leg, an arm, an eye, a votive offering in hopes of a cure. And sometimes, miraculously, it worked. People who had been sick for years would suddenly recover. The lame would walk. The blind would see. These events were meticulously documented by the church as proof of the saint's power. What was happening here? Was it divine intervention? Or was it something else? Something we are only just beginning to understand. This was the power of belief, the power of the mind to heal the body. Today, we call it the placebo effect. It is one of the most mysterious and powerful phenomena in medicine. When a patient truly believes a treatment will work, it often does, even if the treatment itself is inert. The pilgrimage was a powerful, multisensory immersion in the promise of a cure. The difficult journey itself was an act of penance and purification. The atmosphere at the shrine, filled with the prayers and testimonials of other desperate believers, would have created an overwhelming sense of hope and expectation. The ritual of touching the relic was a profound, tangible connection to the possibility of healing. In this heightened state of faith and hope, the brain can release powerful endorphins and other neurochemicals that can reduce pain, modulate the immune system, and promote a genuine physiological healing response. The medieval physicians didn't have the term placebo, but they understood the principle. They knew that a patient's state of mind, their hope, their faith, their will to live, was a crucial factor in their recovery. A good physician wasn't just a technician. He was a master of bedside manner. He knew how to inspire confidence and hope, how to reassure a frightened patient that they were in good hands and that recovery was possible. So, was it all in their heads? In a way, yes, but that doesn't make it any less real. In a world with few effective physical cures, the medicine of the soul was often the most powerful tool they had. It harnessed the incredible, untapped power of the human mind, the belief that a saint's bone could heal you, the faith that a priest's prayer could save you. It was not a sideshow to medieval medicine. It was the main event. It was the force that pulled countless people back from the brink, not through a miracle of divine intervention, but through the even greater miracle of their own unwavering belief. There are certain stories that lodge themselves deep in our collective soul. They are so potent, so tragically perfect, that they transcend history and become myth. And few myths are more powerful or more heartbreaking than the story of the burning of the great library of Alexandria. The image is seared into our minds. A magnificent marble building, the single greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, engulfed in flames. Countless scrolls, the accumulated wisdom of generations of poets, philosophers, scientists, and historians, curling into black ash. The works of Homer in their purest form, lost forever. The lost plays of Sophocles and Euripides, gone. The complete histories of Berosus of Babylon, the astronomical charts of Aristarchus, who argued the sun was the center of the universe centuries before Copernicus, all of it turning to smoke and blowing away on the Mediterranean breeze. It is the ultimate nightmare of the intellectual world, a singular cataclysmic event that plunged humanity back into darkness, a cultural apocalypse from which we have never fully recovered. We mourn it as the greatest loss in the history of knowledge. We point our fingers at the culprits, usually Julius Caesar or later, intolerant Christians or Muslims, and we lament the brutal ignorance that could extinguish such a brilliant light. It is a beautiful, tragic, and incredibly compelling story. And like most stories that are that perfect, it is almost entirely a fiction. The great library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single magnificent fire. Its death was not a dramatic cinematic event. Its end was far slower, far more complex, and in many ways, far more tragic. It didn't die in a blaze of glory. It died a slow, lingering death of 1,000 cuts, bled out over centuries by budget cuts, political purges, ideological shifts, and simple, profound neglect. The story of a single great fire is a convenient scapegoat. It gives us a single moment to mourn, a single villain to blame. It saves us from the much more unsettling truth that a civilization can lose its most precious treasure, not through a violent act of destruction, but through a slow creeping process of simply ceasing to care. The idea that we lost the sum total of ancient knowledge in one fire is a comforting illusion. It absolves us. It suggests that if only that one event hadn't happened, we would have inherited a golden age. The reality is that the library's decline was a mirror of the decline of the intellectual world it served. It wasn't murdered. It faded away. So, let's do this. Let's extinguish the mythical flames. Let's sweep away the ashes of this romantic story and look at the cold, hard evidence. Let's trace the slow, painful, and far more instructive story of how a beacon of knowledge can be allowed to flicker and die. Because the real lesson of the Library of Alexandria is not about the danger of fire. It's about the danger of indifference. Before we can understand how the library died, we have to understand what it was. And the first thing we need to do is get the image of a single grand building out of our heads. The Library of Alexandria wasn't a library in the modern sense. It wasn't a standalone public building where you could check out a scroll. It was something far grander and far more diffuse. It was a research institute, a university, a think tank, and a collection of texts all rolled into one, and it was spread across multiple locations. The story begins, like so much in that era, with Alexander the Great. After he conquered Egypt, he founded the city of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile. It was designed to be the new intellectual and cultural capital of his vast empire. After his death, his general, Ptolemy Soter, took control of Egypt and established a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Greek, but they were also brilliant propagandists. To legitimize their rule over an ancient and proud civilization, they needed to establish Alexandria not just as a center of power, but as the undisputed center of Hellenistic culture and learning. And so, under the patronage of Ptolemy, Elias and his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the Museum, or Shrine of the Muses, was born. This was the heart of the institution. It was a sprawling campus located within the royal palace grounds in the wealthiest quarter of the city. The Museum was not primarily a library. It was a community of scholars. The Ptolemies offered handsome salaries, free food and lodging, and a complete exemption from taxes to the greatest minds of the Greek-speaking world. They brought in poets, philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers, and physicians. It was the ancient world's equivalent of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Archimedes likely studied there. Eratosthenes, the man who calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy, was its head librarian. Euclid, the father of geometry, worked and taught there. The Great Library was the research arm of the museum. It was the collection of scrolls, the raw data that these brilliant minds worked with, and the Ptolemies were obsessive, almost fanatical, in their drive to acquire every text ever written. Their ambition was nothing less than to create a complete catalog of human knowledge. They sent agents across the known world to buy scrolls. They had a policy that any ship docking in Alexandria's harbor had to surrender any books it had on board. The books would be taken to the library, copied by scribes, and the original would be kept for the collection, with the copy being returned to the owner. They even supposedly borrowed the official state copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides from Athens, promising to pay a massive deposit for their safe return. They kept the originals and sent back copies, happily forfeiting the deposit. So, how many scrolls did they have? The numbers are debated and likely exaggerated, but ancient sources claim anywhere from 40,000 to 400,000 scrolls at its peak. Each scroll might only represent a single chapter of a modern book, but the scale of the collection was unprecedented. It was, without question, the largest and most important library in the ancient world. But it wasn't the only one. At some point, probably because the main library was overflowing, a daughter library was established at another location in the city, within the temple complex of the god Serapis, known as the Serapeum. This was a more public-facing institution, located in a working-class neighborhood, and it also housed a significant collection of its own, perhaps acting as an overflow or a more accessible branch for those not admitted to the exclusive museum. This is a crucial point. The Library of Alexandria was not one building. It was a multi-site institution, an ecosystem of knowledge. It was a community of scholars at the museum, a massive research collection attached to it, and a secondary, more public library at the Serapeum. This is not a semantic detail. It is the key to understanding its slow and piecemeal death. You cannot destroy an ecosystem with a single fire, especially when it has a backup. The death of the library was not a singular event, because the library itself was not a singular entity. It was a complex, living organism, and its decline would be a story of multiple wounds inflicted upon different parts of its body over a very long period of time. The first, and most famous, wound was inflicted by Julius Caesar. This is the event that is most often cited as the burning of the library, but the story is far murkier than the legend suggests. The year is 48 BCE. Caesar is in Alexandria, embroiled in a messy civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Caesar finds himself besieged in the royal palace quarter, his back to the sea. In a desperate tactical move to gain control of the harbor, he sets fire to the enemy's fleet. The fire, whipped by the wind, spreads from the ships to the docks and to the warehouses near the port. And this is where the story gets complicated. The Roman philosopher Seneca, writing a century later, claims that 40,000 scrolls were burned in this fire. This has been interpreted by many as the destruction of the great library itself. But let's look at the facts a little more closely. The Great Library, the main research collection attached to the museum, was located inside the royal palace complex. Caesar was defending this very complex. It is highly unlikely that a fire he set to protect his position would have been allowed to spread and consume the very buildings he was occupying. A far more plausible scenario is that the scrolls Seneca mentions were not in the library proper, but were being stored in the warehouses at the port. These could have been scrolls awaiting export, scrolls that had just been confiscated from ships, or perhaps even an overflow collection. It was a tragic loss, no doubt. The destruction of 40,000 books is a catastrophe in any age, but it was almost certainly not the destruction of the main library. The evidence for this is compelling. The geographer Strabo was working at the Museum in Alexandria decades after Caesar's fire, around 20 BCE. He describes the Museum as a vibrant, functioning institution. He talks about its scholars, its public walks, and its dining hall. He even mentions the library, in the present tense, as being part of the museum complex. He doesn't mention a great fire or a tragic loss of books. For Strabo, a man on the ground, the institution was very much alive and well. Furthermore, there are countless references to scholars using and working in the library for centuries after Caesar. The great physician Galen, in the 2nd century CE, talks about the bustling book market in Alexandria and the challenge of finding authentic copies of texts. If the main library had been destroyed, this thriving intellectual culture would make little sense. So, What did Caesar's fire do? It inflicted a serious but not fatal blow. It likely destroyed a significant but not central part of the collection. More importantly, however, it signaled the beginning of the end of an era. Caesar's arrival marked the moment that Alexandria and the Ptolemaic dynasty fell under the shadow of Rome. The city, which had been the independent capital of a powerful kingdom, was now becoming a provincial asset in a larger, more pragmatic empire. The age of the Ptolemies, the lavish patrons who had poured a fortune into their scholarly project with almost religious zeal, was coming to a close. The fire was a physical wound, but the real damage was political. It was the first tremor of a seismic shift in power that would slowly but surely starve the great library of the two things it needed to survive: money and political will. The flames on the docks were a harbinger of a much colder, slower, and more certain death to come. A library is not just a building full of books. It is a living organism. It needs a constant flow of energy to survive. It needs funds to acquire new texts, to repair old ones, and to pay the salaries of the scholars who give it purpose. It needs a constant influx of new minds to read, debate, and build upon the knowledge it contains. And most of all, it needs a stable, supportive environment in which to flourish. A library without money, without scholars, and without peace is not a library. It is a mausoleum of forgotten words. And this is where the real death of the great library began. Not in a sudden inferno, but in the slow, grinding attrition of Roman provincial administration. When Egypt was formally annexed by Rome after the death of Cleopatra in 30 BCE, the game changed completely. The Ptolemies had been patrons of knowledge for its own sake. They poured money into the museum as a matter of prestige and dynastic pride. The Roman emperors, by contrast, were pragmatists. They saw Egypt as a cash cow, the personal breadbasket of the emperor. Pure scholarship, the kind of abstract, philosophical inquiry that had been the hallmark of the museum, was a luxury they had little time or money for. The funding that had been the lifeblood of the institution began to dry up. The generous salaries and tax exemptions that had attracted the best minds from across the Mediterranean were curtailed. The aggressive acquisitions policy, the drive to collect every book in the world, ground to a halt. The library was no longer a growing, dynamic entity. It was a static collection, a relic of a more glorious past. But the damage was far more direct than just financial neglect. The political instability of the later Roman Empire turned Alexandria into a battlefield, and the scholars of the Museum were often caught in the crossfire. In the 3rd century CE, the city became a hotbed of rebellion against Roman rule. The Emperor Caracalla, in a fit of rage in 215 CE, massacred a huge number of the city's young men and reportedly suppressed the Museum, stripping the scholars of their stipends and expelling all foreign members. This was a devastating blow, a political purge that gutted the scholarly community. Decades later, during the wars between the Emperor Aurelian and Queen Zenobia of Palmyra in the 270 SCE, the fighting was particularly fierce in Alexandria. Aurelian's forces besieged and destroyed the Bruchion, the royal quarter of the city, where the museum and the main library were located. The ancient historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing a century later, described how the entire district was razed to the ground, its walls torn down. This was very likely the true physical end of the original Great Research Library. It wasn't burned by Caesar. It was pulverized during a brutal civil war, collateral damage in the death throes of a crumbling empire. The community of scholars was scattered. The buildings were rubble, and the scrolls they contained were likely destroyed, looted, or left to rot in the ruins. This was the real killer of the great library, not a single act of ignorant destruction, but a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. It was the slow strangulation of its funding. It was the political purges that drove away its greatest minds. It was the physical destruction of its buildings in the endless, pointless wars of a dying empire. The fire was a myth. The reality was a slow, inexorable decline, a great institution withering on the vine because the civilization that had created it had lost the will and the ability to sustain it. Knowledge is not a self-perpetuating force. It is a fragile flame that requires constant tending. And the Romans, in their pragmatic, militaristic, and increasingly chaotic world, simply let that flame go out. But even as the great museum crumbled, a flicker of its legacy remained. The flame of knowledge had not been entirely extinguished. It had simply relocated for centuries. The daughter library at the Temple of Serapis, the Serapeum, had been growing in importance. Located on a hill in a different part of the city, it had survived the civil wars that had destroyed the royal quarter. By the 4th century CE, the Serapeum had become the main intellectual center of Alexandria. It was, for all intents and purposes, what was left of the great library. It was a magnificent complex, a testament to the enduring power of knowledge, and it was about to walk into the path of a new and utterly implacable force. The Roman Empire was undergoing a profound transformation. The old pagan gods were dying, and a new faith, Christianity, was rising to take their place. This was not a peaceful transition. It was a cultural revolution, a seismic shift in the very foundations of society. And Alexandria, a city of vibrant competing faiths, Greek paganism, Egyptian traditions, a large Jewish community, and a burgeoning militant Christian population, was the epicenter of this conflict. The Serapeum was more than just a library. It was a temple, one of the grandest and most sacred pagan sites in the entire empire. Its library was filled with the works of the great pagan philosophers, scientists, and poets to the rising Christian community. Led by fiery, uncompromising bishops, the Serapeum was not a beacon of knowledge. It was a fortress of idolatry, a monument to a demonic, false religion that had to be torn down. The scrolls it contained were not a precious heritage. They were the literature of the enemy, filled with dangerous heretical ideas. The final confrontation came in the year 391 CE. Theodosius, the Roman emperor, had issued a series of decrees outlawing pagan practices. The Bishop of Alexandria, a militant and politically savvy man named Theophilus, saw his chance. He rallied a mob of Christian zealots and, with the implicit backing of the state, marched on the Serapeum. A violent clash erupted between the Christians and the pagan defenders who had barricaded themselves inside the temple. The pagans were overwhelmed. The Christian mob stormed the temple complex. According to contemporary accounts, they went on a rampage of destruction. They smashed the pagan idols, defaced the sacred art, and in a final act of symbolic triumph, they likely destroyed the library. The scrolls, the last great collection of the ancient world, were probably torn apart, burned, or scattered. To the mob, this was not an act of vandalism. It was an act of faith, an exorcism, the cleansing of a corrupt and evil place. This was the final, fatal blow. While the main library had died a slow death of neglect and collateral damage, its daughter, the last heir to its legacy, was deliberately and violently murdered in the name of God. This was not a mindless act of ignorance. It was a conscious act of cultural erasure. It was a declaration that a new kind of knowledge, based on divine revelation in Scripture, had superseded the old knowledge based on reason and pagan philosophy. The destruction of the Serapeum was the final chapter in the long, sad story of the library's decline. It was the moment when the last ember of the great Alexandrian intellectual tradition was stamped out. The scattered scholars who remained, like the brilliant female philosopher Hypatia, who was brutally murdered by a Christian mob a few decades later, were relics of a dying world. The age of the open-ended, secular inquiry that the library had championed was over. A new age, the age of faith, had begun. The death of the library at the Serapeum wasn't just the loss of a collection of books, it was the end of a world. So, when we talk about the burning of the Library of Alexandria, what are we really mourning? We are not mourning a single fire. We are mourning a process. We are mourning the way that a brilliant institution, the pinnacle of a civilization's intellectual achievement, can be brought down, not by a single dramatic event, but by the slow, grinding forces of history. The tragedy of the library is not that it burned. The tragedy is that it was allowed to die. Its death began with the slow withdrawal of funding, a society deciding that pure knowledge was a luxury it could no longer afford. It continued with political purges and civil wars, where the lives of scholars and the safety of their books became less important than the outcome of a power struggle. It ended with a wave of ideological zealotry that saw a library not as a treasure, but as a threat. The scrolls themselves were not the ultimate loss. The real treasure of Alexandria was the intellectual culture it fostered. The commitment to collecting knowledge, to debating ideas, to pushing the boundaries of human understanding. The scrolls were just the hardware. The culture was the software, and it was the software that was truly erased. The belief that all knowledge was worth pursuing, that every voice was worth preserving, was replaced by a more dogmatic, more certain, and far less curious worldview. And so the knowledge didn't just vanish in a puff of smoke, it seeped away. Scrolls that were not copied eventually crumbled to dust. Texts that were not read were eventually forgotten. The great scientific and philosophical traditions that had flourished under the Ptolemies withered without patronage and without students. The loss was not a sudden amputation. It was a slow, creeping paralysis. Perhaps this is the real lesson, the one that should keep us awake at night. Libraries don't need a great fire to die. They just need us to stop caring. They need us to decide that their contents are too expensive, too inconvenient, or too dangerous. They need us to forget that a library is not just a building. It's a promise that we will remember the past, that we will question the present, and that we will build a future based on the accumulated wisdom of our species. The Library of Alexandria died because that promise was broken. And so, as the world outside your window grows quiet and the darkness deepens, let the story of this great, lost library settle in your mind. It is not a story of fire and fury. It is a quiet story, a story of slow decay and creeping silence. It is a reminder that the things we cherish most, knowledge, wisdom, curiosity, are not permanent fixtures. They are fragile flames, and they need our constant care to keep from flickering out. Let the rhythmic sound of your own breathing be a comfort. Feel the weight of the blankets around you. The worries of the day, the complexities of the world can fade away now. The past is a vast and quiet place, filled with the echoes of forgotten words and faded scrolls. You have walked through its halls tonight. You have felt its weight, but now it is time to let it go. Let the silence of the library become the silence of your room. Let the darkness of the past become the gentle darkness of sleep. There are no more mysteries to solve tonight, no more lessons to learn. There is only the simple, peaceful act of letting go, drifting now on a quiet tide into the deep and restful and dreamless dark.